Today I'm going to talk about what I think is David Bowie's most underrated album, and that is his 1995 one called One Outside. Now, come on, it's such a great album. Like, I don't know so I think when it came out at the time, it was in a period in David Bowie's career when people were already kind of casting him aside and not really taking him seriously anymore, because because of the longevity of his career. You wouldn't expect that someone in his third decade of making music, fourth decade of 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, fourth decade of making music, they would still be kind of innovating. And it was such a foreign concept, I think, that it automatically maligned him with the critics, because the people who were writing about him in the 90s were people who grew up with him already kind of being passe, I guess, to some extent, with the 80s and his kind of, disco era, and, Tonight, Never Let Me Down, those kind of things. So I think that when he tries to reinvent himself again in the 90s, he isn't as respected anymore, and people just kind of are going into the albums in a very negative way. So Black Tie, White Noise was kind of a bomb for him critically, but I do love that album as well. Not as much as I do One Outside, but it has a lot of solid tracks. I'm a big fan of Palace Athena, for example. Palace Athena is such a great, thriving, bustling, disco-inspired, track. I'm a big fan of that. But One Outside, he kind of goes even further in this very experimental direction. He starts to get inspired by the industrial rock of the early 90s. Specifically, I'd like to say Nine Inch Nails. When you hear the music, it's so much more abrasive and so much darker and harder than most of what Bowie usually makes, and he goes into this album with a concept one that he hadn't done a concept album in a while, I think. But then this one, he kind of goes into it as there's some kind of murder, David Lynchian kind of detective story or whatever. And even without that introduction of this very high concept premise, the album, I think, it has such a consistent mood to it. It has such a consistent flow and energy. There are a lot of really great songs that I think are some of his best. I Have Not Been to Oxford Town is such a great song, has such a great hook. You get this very dark vibe in this album. If you kind of go into it knowing what to expect and opening yourself up to the possibility of it being good, it does get very engaging, and that album, I think, is very great. Let me pull up the track list, because I think that even if you isolate the songs on the album, you will really get a sense in which he still knew how to make great hits. I think one of the songs I think are really good, it's called Hello Space Boy. Hello Space Boy feels like a continuation of the Major Tom story that he started with Space Oddity in '68, and then with Ashes to Ashes in 1980 with Scary Monsters and Scary Sprites. And then when you finally get to One Outside, he listen, if you isolate the songs, they're great. Heart's Filthy Lesson is a great song. Hello Space Boy is great. I Have Not Been to Oxford Town is fantastic. We Prick You is one of my favorite Bowie songs. I think when I first heard it, it felt so familiar to me. I wasn't very sure where, but We Prick You is great. Strangers We Meet, I think, is one of the best Bowie closers. There's just so much great music in this album. Even if you I think the reason why it's so maligned is because, again, it came out at a time when he was already the critics were already kind of out for him, and they were not in the mood to indulge him in his skits, in his high concept, in his new look, in his, he toured with Nine Inch Nails, which was kind of a weird thing for someone like him, because he just came off this disco era and then he suddenly goes into this industrial rock. I guess for some people they might have looked at it and felt perhaps a little empty, a little fake, a little false. But then if you are familiar with David Bowie's career up to that point, he does always constantly change. He's a chameleon. He's very chameleonic. And in this album, it's his first time since, I'd like to say, since the Berlin trilogy, that he reunites with Brian Eno, and that gives that another sense of, you know, coming back to a creative high for him. I think this melding of talent that he does with the fantastic Brian Eno, both of them in the later stages of their careers, but still, I think, very impressive and very engaging. One outside David Bowie, I think that for people who are not very familiar with this, I think you should go into it with healthy expectations. If you're not familiar with David Bowie's career up to this point, try to listen to the songs in isolation. Or perhaps just listen to it thinking of it as an industrial rock album. Listen to some Marilyn Manson, some Nine Inch Nails, you know, and get into the mood for it. And I think you'll have a great time because it's such a great album. I highly recommend it.